Everybody to our special council meeting for Monday, August 12th. I'd like to call this meeting to order. We have Councillor Jason Mady, who is not with us at this moment. We acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi peoples, and of the Huron-Wendat peoples. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and of all the original peoples of Turtle Island who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. Any declarations of conflicts of interest from members of council this evening? Okay, if you find yourself in conflict, please just let us know. Needing a mover and a seconder to adopt the special council meeting agenda for Monday, August 12th. Moved by Councillor Verbeek, seconded by Deputy Mayor Shepley. Any questions? Seeing none, all in favor? And that is carried. Moving on, we will go to public presentations. We have Daryl Abbs, Managing Partner from Watson and Associates. Welcome, Daryl, and he is on virtual with us this evening.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor, and thank you to Council. Would staff be pulling my presentation, or should I share my screen? Perfect.
I think we got it. All right, you're all set.
Thank you very much. So we're here this evening to undertake the development charges public meeting. And this is a mandatory requirement of the Development Charges Act. Next slide, please. So first, we'll talk a little bit about the purpose, why we need to undertake this meeting and what it's for. We'll talk about the study process and timelines that we've undertaken with staff. We'll talk a little bit about what development charges are, and then talk about the proposed charges and policies set out in the development charges background study that we've prepared. We'll also hear presentations or delegations from the public, and then happy to answer any questions from council as well before we formally conclude the public meeting. Next slide, please. And so I mentioned the public meeting is a requirement of the Development Charges Act. And it is really for the public and council to provide feedback or ask questions about the proposed policies and charges set out in the development charges background study. It is something like over 200 pages. So this provides a summary, a brief presentation of those calculations and policies within that document. As well as part of this process, we have to prepare and release that background study at least 60 days before council can pass a development charges bylaw. And I'll show you on the next slide how we've met that timeline. Next slide, please. And so back in the summer of 2023, we started this process, started collecting the information and working with staff to prepare the calculations in the background study itself. On July 26th, we released the development charge background study and proposed bylaws. And then we're here this evening to undertake the public meeting, and it's anticipated council will consider and pass the bylaw on October 7th. Now, I will note the current or the existing development charges bylaw did expire in this month. However, due to some of the changes brought forth by the province, the town was able to extend the expiry date of the bylaw to the end of this year. Next slide, please. And next slide. And so development charges are a revenue tool used by municipalities to recover the capital costs associated with development or growth in the municipality. So as new residents or businesses are constructed within the municipality has to invest in infrastructure to support those houses and businesses. And so the development charges are really to recover that cost of the capital infrastructure that's needed. These costs are in addition to what would normally be constructed as part of a subdivision. So you can think of a typical subdivision, and inside you'll have those internal roads, maybe water mains, sewer mains, sidewalks, street lights. Those are typically constructed by the developer. And then the development charges are to recover the costs for the broader infrastructure to connect those subdivisions to the town's network. We're empowered to impose these charges via the Development Charges Act, and we do so by passing a development charges bylaw, which is part of the background study. Typically, development charges are calculated and payable at the time or just before issuance of a building permit. There are some nuances that I will talk about a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. And so this slide really provides a summary. If we look at the top, we need to service new growth or users. And so I mentioned we have new development and we have to invest in infrastructure to support that development. And so to the extent that the infrastructure is related to growth and new development, we can fund that infrastructure with development charges. If we don't use development charges, the money has to come from somewhere. And where is that from? If it's water or wastewater, that will come from your water or wastewater rates or reserves. And if it's a tax-supported service, it would come from your taxes or tax-supported reserves. Next slide, please. So in a perfect planning world, we would start out with the town's official plan. That official plan is going to set the growth and development we anticipate and all the policies surrounding that. And then we would undertake master plans for each of the different services. And those master plans would identify capital needs to accommodate the growth that's identified in the official plan. Then from there, very simply for development charges, we can do the calculation to estimate what those charges need to be to recover the capital costs to accommodate that development. And so in reality, what tends to happen is some of the timing of these studies may be a bit disjointed. And as part of the development charge background study process, we seek to align the growth that we're looking at servicing, and then the infrastructure needed to accommodate that growth. So it might not align exactly, but that's part of the process and what's set out in the background study. Next slide, please. And so in the Development Charges Act, there's something like 70 clauses which identify how and the parameters in which we need to calculate the development charge. But very simply to summarize, we first need to identify the amount, type, and location of growth and development. Once we know how much we're going to grow by and where it is, we need to identify the servicing needs to accommodate that growth. So for example, maybe it's recreational services we need to accommodate that growth. Item number 3 then says, well, what are the specific capital costs of those specific projects to meet the recreational needs to accommodate the growth? And so in chapter 5 of our development charges background study, for each of the services, which I'll talk about in a moment, we've identified those specific capital needs and those costs. Once we identify those costs, we then need to make a series of deductions. So if we're going to receive any money from grants, subsidies, and other contributions, we need to deduct that from what we can recover. Any share of the projects that benefits the existing community. So for example, if we take a facility, knock it down and build a bigger one, we need to give credit for the facility that's there and reduce the calculation of the charges for that amount. If we exceed the historical service level calculation we have to undertake, we also have to make a deduction. And then if there's any balance in the development charge reserve funds. From there, once we make all the deductions, that gives us our net growth-related cost. We then need to allocate that cost between residential and non-residential benefit and divide it by the growth in each of those categories to calculate the development charge. Next slide, please. So put very simply, we take the cost associated with development, divide it by the anticipated development, and then we get a development charge per unit for residential development and development charge per square foot or per square meter for non-residential development. Next slide, please. So the Development Charges Act lists 19 services for which municipalities can include a development charge in their bylaw. What we've highlighted in the green, blue, teal color are the services we've included as part of the background study. So wastewater services, services related to a highway, which is really roads and public works, policing, fire, parks and recreation services, and POA or Provincial Offences Act. What's not listed here, which is we've identified in the orange box, is growth related studies. And so they are technically a combination of these eligible services, but we can include growth-related studies such as the development charge study in itself as part of the calculations. On the last note on this slide, item number 1, water services, you'll note that we've identified here that water services are actually currently collected as a capital charge as part of the Municipal Act. So we're allowed to impose capital charges under the Municipal Act as well. And that's the historical practice with the town. And so we've recommended to continue that practice through the study. So there's no calculated water development charges. Next slide, please. And next slide. So development charges have been around since the 1950s. They were imposed under the Planning Act, and they were actually referred to as lot levies. There's a formal act prepared in 1989, and then a more refined act in 1997, which is the Development Charges Act that we use today. More recently, over the last 5 years or so, there's been a number of changes introduced by the province. The biggest one being Bill 23, which provided a lot of discounts and reductions to the development charge. And then Bill 185 being the most recent change, which walked back a couple of those changes. And so I'll do my best in the next couple of slides to summarize those changes for you. Next slide, please. So the main change from Bill 108, which is really to bring in installment payments. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, typically development charges are calculated and payable at the time of building permit issuance. But for rental housing and institutional developments, they actually pay in 6 equal annual installments. The first installment upon occupancy, and then each year for the next 5 years, they would pay the rest of the development charge. For developments that proceed through site plan or zoning bylaw amendment applications, their development charge rate is frozen at the time they submit their complete application. The town's going to review the plans, and once the town approves the application, then the developer then has 2 years, actually that's now been reduced to 18 months, to pull a building permit. And if they pull their building permits within that 18-month window, their development charge rate will stay frozen at the rate when they submitted their application, which could be 2 years in the past. Otherwise, if they take longer than that 18 months, then they would pay the development charge rate when they pull their building permit. Okay. In addition to that, you can impose interest on those installment payments or that rate freeze. Bill 197 brought in removal of this mandatory deduction that we used to have to do. So back in the 2019 development charge background study, we undertook the calculations and then we had to do a mandatory 10% deduction. We no longer need to do that, so that's been removed. And it also provided that list of 19 eligible services. Lastly, it brought in community benefit charge legislation, which we have not undertaken a calculation for that here. This is a new revenue tool that municipalities can use. It's imposed under the Planning Act for high density development. There's an exemption for universities and then some more reporting requirements for the annual treasurer statement. Next slide, please. So then Bill 23 came in and provided a number of exemptions and reductions. So there's exemptions for affordable housing units required through inclusionary zoning bylaws, nonprofit housing, additional residential units. So for singles, semis, or townhomes, you can add up to 2 apartments, either let's say in your basement, or you can add 1 in the basement of your home and 1 on a garage, for example, and you don't have to pay development charges on those 2 additional apartments. Affordable owned or rental units, and I'll talk about the definition of that is, and then attainable units, which currently is not yet enforced because there's still no definition of that. There's a discount for rental housing based on the number of bedrooms you have in those units. That can be anywhere from 15 to 25% discount on the charge. They removed housing as an eligible service, which doesn't affect the town, but would affect, let's say, the generally upper tier municipalities. And then they did remove studies as being eligible, but now they've recently added that back in. And then they introduced this mandatory phase-in, where no matter what we calculated as part of the development charge, in the first year we could only impose 80%, and then step it up 5% for the next 5 years. Luckily, they've removed that with the most recent change as well. There's a maximum rate we can impose on the installments. There's a requirement to allocate monies in the reserve funds for water, wastewater, and roads. And so 60% of the monies we have as a balance at the beginning of the year. We need to allocate that to specific projects. We don't need to spend it per se, we just need to allocate it. Okay, and then the last change for Bill 23 was they extended the bylaw life. So previously bylaws were good for 5 years. Now bylaws can last up to 10 years. Next slide, please. So in terms of the affordable housing exemptions for rental units or owned units, what they provided for definition is where rent or your purchase price is such that you are not spending more than 30% of the average person's income on rent or the ownership of a home. And so to identify this, the province has released a bulletin, and that bulletin will have a value beside each of the different unit types for ownership or rental. And as long as the sales price or the rental price is at that number or below, then those units would be subject to an exemption from the development charge. There's a requirement to enter into an agreement with the person pulling the building permit. And so municipalities across the province are working on what those agreements might look like. But if the town does find themselves dealing with some of these units, at that time, you'll have to create an agreement with these builders or developers to provide that exemption, because they have to guarantee as part of that agreement that those units remain affordable for a period of 25 years. And then lastly, the most recent changes that came in this year walked back the mandatory phase-in, allow you to include growth-related studies in the charge, and then shorten that window for that DC rate freeze to 18 months. And then provided a process for municipalities trying to align with those changes to the legislation to update their bylaws relatively quickly. That's the section that allowed the town to extend your existing bylaw to the end of the year. Lastly, for municipalities that don't have a newspaper of record in their municipality, they can actually post the requirements, the public notice requirements on their website rather than in a newspaper in a nearby municipality. Next slide, please. And next slide. Okay, so I mentioned a number of these exemptions as they were brought in from Bill 23. But in addition, there are some other mandatory exemptions that you have to abide by. And so upper tier, lower tier governments don't charge each other development charges. So when you build a facility, if the county had a development charge, they wouldn't charge you, and vice versa. Similarly with the school boards. Industrial buildings can expand their footprint up to 50%, and they don't have to pay a DC. If they expand more than that 50%, then they would start paying DCs on the size above that 50%. So I mentioned a number of these other exemptions as well, all brought in from Bill 23. Next slide, please. So in addition to those mandatory exemptions that we have to abide by, council does have the ability to reduce the charge in whole or in part for different types or classes of development. And so you can see on the bottom there what we have included for those discretionary exemptions in the draft bylaw will be places of worship, bona fide farms, hospitals, and cemeteries or burial grounds. Now, you can phase in the charge over time as well. That counts as an exemption. Just wanting to note that any exemption you provide needs to be funded from other sources. So it needs to come from taxes or rates. The last bullet there talks about redevelopment credits. And so this isn't something that needs to be funded from other sources, but through case law, it's been determined that, let's say, for example, I have a single detached home, I knock it down and build 5 townhomes. Then when I go to pay my development charge, the way we calculate it, it's the townhome rate times 5 minus one single detached equivalent development charge. Okay, so you get a credit for what's being taken down. Next slide, please. So I won't go through this in detail. I just want to note this for the public. But as part of, I mentioned this earlier on in the presentation, development charges are to recover the capital costs in addition to what a developer would normally construct. And so as part of the development charge background study in Appendix E, we've set out this local service policy to clearly identify what's the developer's responsibility as part of the local service policy. So that would be in orange on this diagram. And then what we would recover from development charges, which would be identified in the blue in this diagram. Okay, and so in that policy, we've set out for all the different services, what's the town's responsibility, what's the developer's responsibility. Next slide, please. Okay. Couple other matters, cross-subsidization just says that if we're going to have a shortfall in one type of development, let's say from exemptions, we can't recover that from another type of development by increasing their charge. We have to release the background study, as I mentioned, 60 days before bylaw passage. And then every year, we would index the development charge. So we're going to calculate the development charge now, and then each year until we come back and update the bylaw, we would index the development charge using this Statistics Canada index. Next slide, please. Okay, I mentioned the timing of payment already, so I won't go over this again. Just reiterating that typically DCs are at building permit, except for those special cases, rental housing or institutional pay in installments. And if you proceed through site plan or zoning bylaw amendment applications, your rate is frozen for a certain period of time. Next slide, please. Okay, and next slide. So in terms of calculating the rates, when we're looking at that growth that we're trying to accommodate, we've separated this into two. So the top table identifies that over the 10-year period for the whole town, we're looking at just under 2,600 people in just under 1,000 residential units and about 8.6 million square feet of non-residential floor space. The table on the bottom is what was used for the wastewater services. So looking at the urban build out of the lands, identifying what the growth forecast is in each of those different wards, because we have the different service areas for wastewater. And then you'll see on the very far right, we also have a special area specific charge for the industrial service area, which I will touch on. Next slide, please. So the current development charge rates, and on the next slide, I have the calculated development charge rates, which shows the full table. I won't go through all the numbers here. In the next couple of slides, I'll show you a comparison side by side. But just wanting to note that for the residential charges, we do have different charges for the different types of units. So the single and semi-detached, multiples, which are your townhomes, apartments, large and small, and then special care, special dwelling units, which are like long-term care homes and retirement homes. On the non-residential side, we have the non-residential charge per square foot on the far right, and we also have different charges for wind turbines and solar farms. Okay, next slide, please. Again, for informational purposes, this is the calculated development charge rates, but I'll compare them in the next couple slides. Next slide, please. So in addition to the 4 ward wastewater charges, we've also identified an industrial service area, which is just to the west of the Ward 1 boundary. And there's some very localized capital needs for this area that's identified in the map. And the total capital costs identified here about $781,000 for water and just over $2 million for wastewater. And so the way we would recover these capital costs is partly through development charges, but because they're also going to service the existing properties in this area, we would also recover them through capital charges under the Municipal Act. So if we go to the next slide, this provides a summary of what the charges are for each of these different properties identified in this map. And you can see what's identified in the wastewater DC column would be recovered through development charges, and that's from those new properties that we'll be developing. And then what's identified in the next two columns, the capital charge columns, those would be charges imposed under the Municipal Act. Okay, and then so to simplify it for these properties, we've identified the total amount payable on the far right, which totals that just under $2.82 million for the water and the wastewater capital needs. Next slide, please. So to summarize the kind of way we're going to collect the capital charges, for wastewater, if it's a new development or we're redeveloping a property, we would recover the capital costs through development charges. If it's for water services, we're actually going to continue to recover that through the Municipal Act, Part 12 of the Municipal Act, capital charges, they're connection charges that you might know them as. If they're existing properties that are not yet serviced with water or wastewater, and they want to connect to the water or wastewater system, so let's say, for example, you have a street and it's unserviced adjacent to new development, and you want to service that existing street, then those existing properties would connect in. Because they're existing properties, we cannot charge them a development charge. So we would also impose that capital charge under the Municipal Act. Okay, so this slide just summarizes what authority you have to impose the capital charges. And so as part of this background study, we've identified a schedule and a Part 12 or Municipal Act bylaw to recover the capital costs or the connection charges for wastewater, which would be equivalent to the development charge. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the rate comparison side by side. And so if we're looking at the townwide services, we're looking at the kind of blue line there. And so for all services except for water or wastewater, the current charge is $11,761, going up to $19,971. And you can see we've inked the charge for services related to highway or roads has increased, as well as the component related to public works. This is something that we see across the province, where the capital costs for roads or water and wastewater have increased significantly just because of the municipal tender prices. The bottom section identifies the area-specific charges for the wastewater areas, so the Ward 1, Ward 2, Ward 3, and Ward 4. You'll note that the Ward 1 charge is actually going down. This is because all we're recovering is the reserve fund deficit. We don't have additional capital costs to recover for Ward 1 at the moment. For Ward 2, you'll see the charge is significantly higher. This is to reflect the potential wastewater treatment plant that would be required to provide additional capacity in this area. And what we've based this charge on, because right now it's the analysis is still being undertaken. We've looked at reasonable costs of wastewater treatment plants in other jurisdictions and applied that cost to the anticipated growth in Ward 2 to come up with the $15,144. For the Ward 3 charges, the increase again is reflective of the increase in costs for the wastewater treatment plant that's required in Ward 3. And then Ward 4, those increasing costs are reflective of the increase in infrastructure costs for the pump station and the EA that's identified for that area. Next slide, please. And this shows you the comparison for non-residential charges. You'll see the townwide charges for the non-residential growth are actually decreasing. This is because the share of the growth that's anticipated to be non-residential has decreased relative to last time. So you'll see the overall townwide charge is only 62 cents, whereas the Currently, it would be $2.33. And then you can see again for each of the wards, what the non-residential charge would be. Next slide, please. Okay, so looking at the calculated charges, which you can see denoted with the different colored arrows, relative to the comparator municipalities, so other municipalities in the county as well as Chatham-Kent, you'll see that it varies depending on the different ward you're in. Okay, so you can see Ward 1 is in the lower middle, Ward 4 as well, and then Ward 3 kind of upper middle, and Ward 2 would be just below Windsor, just above Lakeshore and Tecumseh. Now, I will note that Tecumseh just passed their bylaw in July. The town of Amherstburg is anticipating completion of the development charge bylaw and study by the end of this year. Lakeshore is planning an update, I believe, in 2025. Similarly, so is LaSalle. So some of these numbers will be changing within the next year. Next slide, please. When we look at the non-residential charges, you'll see you're actually at the lower end of the survey. And if we go to the next slide, we'll look at industrial, which you'll see again, lower end of the survey, except for Chatham, Kent, and Windsor, which provide exemptions for industrial development. Next slide, please. So subsequent to this meeting, once it's formally concluded, the next step would be council to consider the bylaw on October 7th. Next slide. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Drusevich for a few comments.
Thank you through the chair, and thank you, Daryl. I do just want to note that we did receive a submission of questions today. We are formulating a response to those, and all questions and answers that occur via email or in this room will be addressed publicly and directly to the person posing the question. So a public link will be made with all questions that are posed tonight if they're not available for answer tonight. Thanks.
To council, keeping in mind that we do have members of the public, I want to open the floor to them. Anything quick from council? Okay. If there's anybody here in the audience that would wish to pose a question to our consultant or administration, please just, I don't know, you could just raise your hand and then we'll go back to the delegate stand and you turn on the mic. And you state their name. State your name. Question? Yep, sure. Go, sir, just stand up, go behind you. And you got to turn on the mic. Kate will help you there.
Larry, 14016 Pinkerton Side Road. The property's 15.8 acres, 6.22 hectares. I have an existing building. I'm wondering if how would I pay $450,000 to that property? How many years would I get to pay for it?
Nick, if you want to just turn off your mic, I'll have Director Drusevich answer that. Thank you.
Chair, the town would look at very lenient payment options, anywhere between 15 to 20 years, depending on the property owner's request.
Even on the letter that we got, it was 5 to 10 years. 20 years is a totally different story. It makes me a little more comfortable, but hopefully, I don't know, $2.8 million to run services. I think it's a bit extreme. I'm sure there's plenty of contractors that would bid probably take $1 million off of that. And if that's the case, would the development charges be reduced?
Through the chair, part of those costs or development charges, a large portion assessed those lands are through Part 12. When those Part 12 costs are assessed, they are done on actual costs. So not necessarily what is referenced in the letter. If the tender comes back in drastically lower, it is allocated in that same proportionate way, but based on actual costs. So just like you had said, if it comes at $1 million lower, everyone proportionately receives $1 million of less costs.
That clear it up, Nick? Okay, any further comments? I think we have some members of our development community here. Deputy Mayor Shepley?
Wondering what, if there is any expected impact from the proposed development charges fund for future growth, if there's any impact that you think this will have?
I can't speculate on such. What I can say is from the reasonability chart, you saw that most municipalities are increasing their development charges in accordance with the increases that we're seeing in tender prices.
One question. We have a I have a few, but non-residential gross floor area square foot increase in Ward 3 is really high. Like, what are we predicting is going to be happening in Ward 3? Like 10 more wineries? Like, it's not residential. So I'm just wondering what's coming in Ward 3 that I don't particularly know about. I'm not sure if anybody even knows that. It's on page 23, the non-residential gross floor area for Ward 3. That's one of my questions. My second question is, and I don't know if anybody can answer this, but I want it on record. Ward 2, for the residents in our municipality, are the residents in the municipality of Amherstburg paying the same, or are we paying more than them when it comes to I think it's the wastewater? I want to make sure that our residents aren't subsidizing the town of Amherstburg. My other question is and I'll send these two, why are we not collecting for stormwater drainage in wards 1 and 4? And my other question is, community benefit charge legislation. Why aren't we investigating that? I'm not saying we should, I'm just wondering why we aren't. So those are my three. I don't know. Director Drusevich?
Through the chair, I'll actually pass this to Daryl to address what he can, and then we can pick up any missing.
So to the mayor, so for your first question, Ward 3, the non-residential floor space that's identified. So when we've looked at the ward, we've looked at the build out of the ward, so build out of the servicing area. And so this would just be the lands that are identified for non-residential zoning. If we take what they're zoned for and estimate what that square footage could be, it doesn't necessarily mean there's specific businesses or types of development identified to make that 5.6 million. It's what those lands are zoned for, because that's what we're building the infrastructure for, is to accommodate the lands that are identified in the service area. Your second question on Ward 2, and to make sure that we're not subsidizing the town of Amherstburg, no, you're not. And so what we've identified here is an estimate based on cost per cubic meter of a treatment plant in other jurisdictions for a similar type of treatment plant that's anticipated to be here. That same estimate would be identified as part of the town of Amherstburg's development charge background study that will come out later. So the overall capital cost will be determined through an EA that's being undertaken. And then the specific cost shares will be identified through an agreement between the two towns. The third question, I believe, was related to the stormwater infrastructure. And the stormwater infrastructure in most municipalities typically falls as part of the road cost. So if there's the drainage or storm mains as part of the road construction, we'll include that capital cost as part of the construction of the road. In some jurisdictions, there's separate storm infrastructure identified as a development charge, but only in very rare instances. And I think that's all of them, or is there one more part of the question?
Benefit charge. Just why did we not look at that? It's just a question.
So community benefit charges, it's something that municipalities you can look at. I know the town of Lakeshore, or municipality of Lakeshore, is looking at it. But it really only applies to high density development where there's 5 stories or more and 10 residential units or more. So generally, as municipalities, until you start having a significant amount of high density development anticipated as part of your forecast, you wouldn't really identify it. What it is for, it's for capital costs that are not DC eligible. So it could be things like town hall expansions or public art or things where that you wouldn't collect through development charges, but other services. So it's something you can look at in the future. But looking at your anticipated growth forecast, you don't have a significant amount of high density development anticipated. But once you do start to see that coming through, then I think you may want to look at it at that point.
Okay, sir, just please go back to the mic and state your name, please.
Aaron Hanukkah, I own property next to Nick's, 14028 Pinkerton Side Road. So a couple questions. So just to clarify, so the wastewater reserve has been used for this, a portion of this construction on the wastewater side, is that right? Or does the town have a wastewater reserve that is going to be, a portion of this is going to be allocated to that?
Okay, I will have Director Drusevich answer that.
Through the chair, the development wastewater reserve will be used and has been incorporated in this. When it comes to wastewater rates on its own, it's for existing only. So we cannot use that reserve to cover any growth
So-
for existing users.
Okay, so it can't be applied to the capital cost to help offset the pain that we're going to feel as
Correct.
property owners? Okay, that's disappointing. So do we have to connect?
Through the chair, under Part 12, yes, mandatory connection would apply.
So even though so what's the benefit to us to connect?
Chair, the benefit would be access to town infrastructure.
Well, we don't need that. We've got septic, weeping bed, we've got a well, we operate fine every day. We've put in our time, we pay our taxes, so why should we have to pay?
Director Gerard, like, it's mandatory, or can they go on septic systems? Can any development that is not currently connected go on septic systems? Director Drusevich?
Through the chair, from a growth point of view, should these properties not be incorporated into this calculation, the town be responsible for sitting on those costs, which would then be apportioned to existing residents who have no benefit to the system.
Well, at the same time, we have no benefit to the system either.
I think you made your point there.
Okay, so the other thing is how many hookups do we have per property? Are we allowed per property? Is it one per property? If there's multiple buildings, can we have multiple connections?
Director Gerard?
That would be determined through building permit process. So at the time when they make that connection, they'll be required to get a plumbing permit from the building department, which would determine what those services would be. Furthermore, it sounds like this property may be subject to site plan through certain improvements to the site. Through site plan control, it could be one or multiple services depending on the approval and reviews of that site plan.
I guess one last thing. So I guess to my point, I don't really see a benefit to us, and our cost doesn't just stop at the curb. So our cost to carry on into our property, multiple buildings, so our $288,000 for wastewater and freshwater could easily be $500,000 or whatever. So I guess that's the gift to us.
Any members of council have any questions? Councilor McGuire Blaze.
Thank you through the chair. I'd like to be paid as a director. When these other properties are being serviced, will their designation change? Like right now, I'm pretty sure they're agricultural lands. No? Can you correct me? What are they? And will servicing them change them in any way that they could benefit in the future from it?
Through you, Mayor Bondi, the properties are actually zoned and in the official plan for industrial purposes. So they may be utilized currently as agricultural, but the intended future use and the zoning is industrial.
Members of council? Okay, seeing none at this time, I need a motion that we receive the presentation by Daryl Abs, Managing Partner for Watson and Associates. We're just receiving it tonight. We're not adopting it. So if members of the public or the development community or even council have feedback, send it in. Moved by Councillor Guerin, supported by Deputy Mayor Shepley. Any further questions? All in favor? And that is carried. I need a motion to adjourn our special council meeting and we will resume our regular council meeting at 6. Moved by Councillor Hammond, supported by Councillor McGuire Blaze. Any questions? All in favor? Thank you for joining us and see you in a few minutes.